I never thought loading shotgun shells with steel ball bearings would save my entire company. My name is Sergeant First Class Robert Bobby Callahan, and in the summer of 1944, I was a 28-year-old weapons sergeant with the 164th Infantry Regiment, American Division, fighting the Japanese in the dense jungles of Bougainville in the Solomon Islands. I'd grown up in rural Alabama, spent my teenage years hunting everything from squirrels to wild boar, with whatever ammunition I could afford or improvise, and learned early that sometimes unconventional solutions worked better than conventional ones. When I arrived in the Pacific Theater in late 1943, I brought with me not just standard Army training, but a lifetime of practical knowledge about firearms, ammunition, and making do with what you had. The steel ball shot I developed was born from necessity, refined through experimentation, and initially got me threatened with disciplinary action for manufacturing unauthorized ammunition. But on the night of August 8, 1944, when 1,000 screaming Japanese soldiers launched a Banzai charge against our undermanned perimeter, those improvised shells became the difference between survival and annihilation. The morning of July 20, 1944, started with me standing in front of Captain William Henderson, my company commander, trying to explain why I'd been modifying shotgun ammunition in violation of Army regulations. Henderson was 34 years old, a by-the-book officer from Pennsylvania, who believed in following procedures and maintaining good order and discipline. The improvised ammunition I'd been creating didn't fit his worldview of how the Army should operate. "Sergeant Callahan, I've received reports that you've been disassembling standard shotgun shells and replacing the shot with steel ball bearings," Henderson said, his voice tight with barely controlled frustration. "You've been using machine shop equipment to manufacture ammunition that hasn't been tested, approved, or authorized by anyone in the chain of command. Care to explain what the hell you think you're doing?" I'd known this conversation was coming. Other soldiers had seen me working on the shells, word had spread, and eventually it reached officers who cared about regulations more than results. I'd prepared my explanation carefully, knowing that Henderson valued logic even if he didn't like improvisation. "Sir, the standard buckshot loads we're issued for the Winchester Model 97 trench guns are inadequate for the combat we're facing here," I began. "They're designed for close-range combat at 10 to 15 meters, but in jungle fighting, we're frequently engaging enemy soldiers at 25 to 30 meters in dense vegetation. At those ranges, standard buckshot loses too much energy and doesn't penetrate thick jungle cover effectively. I've been replacing the lead shot with hardened steel ball bearings of slightly larger diameter. The steel maintains velocity and energy better over distance, and it penetrates vegetation that would stop or deflect standard shot." Henderson leaned back in his chair, his expression skeptical. "Sergeant, there are reasons we use standardized ammunition. Safety testing, quality control, consistent performance. You're not an ammunition engineer. You're modifying military ordnance based on, what? Your experience hunting in Alabama. That's reckless and dangerous." "With respect, sir, I've fired over 200 rounds of the modified ammunition through multiple shotguns over the past month," I replied. "I've documented the results, tested penetration at various ranges, and confirmed safe pressure levels. The modification works, it's safe, and it's significantly more effective than standard loads for the combat conditions we face here. I'm not guessing. I've tested it thoroughly." "Testing it yourself doesn't make it authorized," Henderson said flatly. "You're to cease manufacturing this ammunition immediately. Any shells you've already produced will be turned in for disposal. You'll return to using standard issued ammunition. That's an order. Dismissed." I saluted and left his office, frustrated but not surprised. The Army ran on standardization and procedures, and my improvised ammunition violated both, but I'd seen enough combat to know that what worked on a testing range in the States didn't always work in the jungles of the Pacific. The enemy didn't care about our regulations, and sometimes survival required thinking beyond the manual. The idea for the steel ball shot had come to me during a firefight in June. My squad had engaged a Japanese patrol at about 25 meters in thick jungle. I'd fired my shotgun, standard buckshot load, at an enemy soldier partially concealed behind dense vegetation. The shot pattern had been disrupted by the leaves and vines. Most of the pellets had lost energy penetrating the jungle cover, and the target had escaped wounded, but alive. Meanwhile, rifle fire from our M1 Garand was effectively penetrating the same cover and hitting targets. That night, I'd started thinking about the problem. Shotguns were devastating at close range, but their effectiveness dropped rapidly with distance, and when shooting through vegetation. The multiple small pellets in a buckshot load lost energy quickly and were easily deflected by obstacles. What if I could maintain the spread pattern of a shotgun, but use fewer, heavier projectiles that retained energy better and penetrated obstacles more effectively? I'd remembered something from my hunting days in Alabama. When we couldn't afford proper buckshot, we'd sometimes use ball bearings from the local machine shop, loading them into shotgun shells for hunting wild boar. The steel bearings were harder and heavier than lead shot, maintained velocity better, and punched through thick brush that would stop standard shot. It was crude and improvised, but it worked. The principle should apply to military use as well. I'd started experimenting in late June, working with Corporal Jim Martinez, our company armorer, who had access to tools and materials. Martinez was 24 years old from New Mexico and had worked in his family's gunsmith shop before the war. He understood firearms and ammunition at a technical level that complemented my practical hunting experience. "Bobby, this is either brilliant or insane. I'm not sure which," Martinez had said when I first explained my idea. "You want to replace 9 pellets of size 00 buckshot with 6 larger steel ball bearings. The military is going to love that." "They don't have to love it. It just has to work," I'd replied. "Standard buckshot load is 9 pellets at about 8.5 millimeters diameter. I want to use 6 ball bearings at 10 millimeters. Fewer projectiles, but each one hits harder, penetrates better, and maintains energy at longer range. In jungle fighting, that's more useful than a tight pattern at 10 meters. We'd spent weeks refining the load, testing different sizes and quantities of steel bearings, adjusting powder charges to maintain safe pressures, and documenting the results. The final version used 6 10mm hardened steel ball bearings in place of the standard 9 lead buckshot pellets. The spread pattern was slightly wider due to the different aerodynamics, but each individual projectile carried significantly more energy and penetrated vegetation much more effectively than standard loads. The testing had been promising. At 25 meters, the steel ball shot maintained enough energy to reliably incapacitate targets and penetrated jungle vegetation that would stop or significantly disrupt standard buckshot. At 15 meters, the close range where shotguns were traditionally most effective, the steel balls were devastating, each one carrying enough energy to inflict catastrophic wounds. The modification extended the effective range of the shotgun from about 15 meters to nearly 30 meters in jungle conditions, a significant tactical advantage. But Captain Henderson didn't care about tactical advantages if they came from unauthorized modifications to equipment. He cared about following regulations, maintaining discipline, and not having his soldiers blow themselves up with improvised ammunition. His order to cease production and turn in the existing shells was legally and administratively correct, even if it was tactically questionable. I complied with the order officially. I turned in about half of the steel ball shells I'd manufactured, keeping the rest hidden in my personal gear. It was insubordination, but I rationalized it by telling myself that if I needed them, it would be because the tactical situation demanded them, and any disciplinary consequences would be worth surviving the immediate threat. Martinez did the same, squirreling away a few boxes of the modified ammunition against future need. "You're playing a dangerous game," Martinez told me, as we concealed the remaining shells. "If Henderson finds out you didn't turn them all in, you're looking at court-martial. If I need these shells and don't have them, I'm looking at being dead," I replied. "I'll take my chances with the court-martial." The weeks following Henderson's order were frustrating. We continued operations in the jungle, continued encountering situations where the steel ball shot would have been useful, and continued using standard ammunition that I knew was suboptimal for the conditions. Japanese forces on Bougainville were increasingly desperate, conducting more frequent and aggressive attacks as they were pushed into smaller defensive perimeters. Intelligence reports suggested they were preparing for major counter-offensive operations, though we didn't know the timing or scale. By early August, our company was assigned to hold a key defensive position overlooking a critical supply route. The position was undermanned. We had about 80 soldiers holding a perimeter that should have been defended by twice that many, but the entire division was spread thin across multiple operational areas. We dug in, established fields of fire, prepared defensive positions, and waited. The Japanese attack came on the night of August 8, 1944, and it was unlike anything I'd experienced before. Around 0200 hours, the jungle erupted with the sounds of hundreds of voices screaming, whistles blowing, and the distinctive battle cry of Banzai echoing through the darkness. A Banzai charge, a mass infantry assault where Japanese soldiers attacked in waves with bayonets and swords, accepting massive casualties in an attempt to overwhelm defensive positions through sheer numbers and ferocity. I was manning a fighting position on the left side of our perimeter with 3 other soldiers. Private Danny Wilson, a 19-year-old from Iowa on his first combat deployment, Corporal Marcus Thompson, a 23-year-old veteran from Georgia with 6 months of combat experience, and Private First Class Li Chang, a 21-year-old Chinese-American from California who'd volunteered immediately after Pearl Harbor. We had 2 M1 Garand rifles, 1 Browning automatic rifle, my Winchester Model 97 trench gun, and about 500 rounds of mixed ammunition between us. Jesus Christ, how many of them are there? Wilson shouted over the cacophony of screaming Japanese soldiers and rifle fire erupting along our perimeter. More than I want to count, Thompson replied, already firing controlled bursts with the bar at muzzle flashes visible in the jungle darkness. Just shoot anything that moves toward our position. The initial wave of attackers hit our perimeter like a tsunami. Japanese soldiers emerged from the jungle in groups of 10 to 20, charging forward with bayonets fixed, firing as they came, overwhelming some positions through sheer numbers and momentum. The noise was indescribable, hundreds of men screaming and shooting, grenades exploding, the crack of rifles and the heavier boom of our defensive weapons trying desperately to break up the assault. Our position was relatively strong, good fields of fire to our front and flanks, but as I watched the attack develop, I realized with sickening certainty that standard defensive tactics weren't going to be enough. The Japanese were coming in such numbers that even effective rifle fire couldn't stop them all. They were accepting casualties that would break most units and continuing to advance. Within minutes, they'd be in our positions, and close quarters fighting with bayonets and rifle butts would begin. I made a decision that would either save us or get me court-martialed. I dropped the standard ammunition I'd been using and pulled out the hidden steel ball shells, the ones I'd been ordered to turn in but had kept for exactly this kind of situation. "Cover me while I reload," I shouted to the others, then began feeding the steel ball shells into the Winchester's tube magazine. The Winchester Model 97 was a pump-action shotgun with a 5-round capacity plus 1 in the chamber. It was designed for trench warfare, devastating at close range but limited in effectiveness at distance. What I was about to do would either validate months of unauthorized experimentation or prove that I should have followed Captain Henderson's orders. The first wave of Japanese soldiers broke into the open about 25 meters from our position, a group of about 15 men charging directly at us through a clear avenue in the jungle. At that range, standard buckshot would have wounded some of them but probably wouldn't have stopped the charge. The steel ball shot was designed for exactly this situation. I aimed at the center of the charging group and fired. The recoil was slightly heavier than standard loads, but within acceptable limits. Through the darkness and chaos, I saw multiple attackers go down instantly, not wounded but killed outright by the energy of the steel balls at medium range. I worked the pump action, fired again at another group, saw similar results. The steel bearings were punching through the light brush and hitting targets that standard shot would have missed or only wounded. "Holy shit, what are you shooting?" Thompson yelled, having noticed the unusually effective results from my shotgun. "Something I wasn't supposed to have," I replied, firing my 4th and 5th rounds at approaching enemy soldiers. "Just keep shooting. I'll explain later if we survive." The battle continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes of sustained combat. The Japanese kept coming in waves, accepting horrific casualties, determined to break through our lines through sheer weight of numbers. Our position became the focus of a particularly heavy assault, possibly because the attackers recognized it as a weak point, or possibly just because that's where the momentum of their charge carried them. I fired every steel ball shell I had, 24 rounds total, each one more effective than standard ammunition would have been at the ranges we were fighting. The heavier steel balls maintained enough energy at 20 to 30 meters to reliably kill or incapacitate targets, and they penetrated the jungle vegetation that would have disrupted standard shot patterns. At one point, a group of 6 Japanese soldiers charged our position from 15 meters out, and a single steel ball shot dropped 3 of them immediately, the others being taken down by rifle fire from Thompson and Chang. When I finally ran out of steel ball shells and switched back to standard ammunition, The difference was immediately noticeable. The standard loads were still effective at close range, but they lacked the consistent stopping power at medium ranges that the steel balls had provided. I'd been spoiled by the improved performance, and going back to standard ammunition felt like fighting with one hand tied behind my back. The Banzai charge finally broke around 2:45 hours, the surviving Japanese soldiers withdrawing back into the jungle after suffering casualties that must have approached 50% of their assault force. Our perimeter held, though barely, and several positions had been temporarily overrun before counterattacks restored our lines. Final counts suggested we'd faced between 800 and 1,000 attackers, an overwhelming force that should have broken through our undermanned defenses, but had been stopped by determined resistance and effective defensive fire. As dawn broke and we assessed the situation, the evidence of the night's fighting was overwhelming. Bodies of Japanese soldiers lay in piles in front of our positions, testimony to the ferocity of their assault and the effectiveness of our defense. Captain Henderson made his way along the perimeter, checking casualties and congratulating soldiers who'd held their positions against impossible odds. When he reached my fighting position, his expression was complicated, mixing relief that we'd survived with concern about something he'd observed. "Sergeant Callahan, I've been examining enemy casualties in your sector. Multiple bodies show wound patterns inconsistent with standard buckshot, larger entry wounds, deeper penetration, more catastrophic tissue damage. Want to tell me what ammunition you were using?" I could have lied, but there was no point. The evidence was literally lying in front of our position, and Henderson wasn't stupid. "Sir, I used the steel ball shells I developed, the ones you ordered me to turn in. I kept some for emergency use, and last night qualified as an emergency." Henderson was quiet for a long moment, looking at the evidence of the night's fighting, the bodies of enemy soldiers that had been stopped by fire from our position, the defensive line that had held when it easily could have collapsed. Finally he spoke, his voice carefully neutral. "Sergeant, you disobeyed a direct order. You manufactured and used unauthorized ammunition. By rights, I should have you up on charges." He paused, then added, "You also probably saved this entire position from being overrun. The volume of effective fire you were able to deliver at medium ranges exceeded what we should have been able to achieve with standard shotgun ammunition. I've been walking the perimeter all morning, and your sector shows the highest ratio of enemy casualties to defenders. That didn't happen by accident." "No, sir. It happened because I had the right ammunition for the tactical situation," I said. "Standard buckshot is great for close-range fighting in trenches or urban environments. It's inadequate for jungle combat at the ranges we're actually fighting. The steel ball shot extends the effective range of the shotgun to match the actual engagement distances we face. Last night proved that." Henderson nodded slowly. "I'm going to make some calls to division headquarters. We need to get your ammunition properly tested and evaluated. If it performs as well as it appeared to last night, we need to be producing it at scale and issuing it throughout the division. But Sergeant, let me be clear. You don't get to decide on your own what rules apply and what rules don't. If I hadn't seen the results with my own eyes, you'd be facing serious disciplinary action. You got lucky that your unauthorized improvisation worked. Don't mistake that luck for vindication of ignoring orders." "Understood, sir," I replied. Though I'd argue it wasn't luck. I tested the ammunition extensively. I knew it would work because I'd verified it would work. But I understand your point about following proper channels. Over the next 2 weeks, my steel ball ammunition underwent formal evaluation by division ordnance officers and weapons specialists brought in from Corps headquarters. They conducted the testing I'd already done, arrived at the same conclusions I'd reached, and ultimately recommended adoption of the modified ammunition for jungle combat operations. By September 1944, steel ball shotgun shells were being manufactured at division level and issued to all units equipped with trench guns. The formal designation was Shotgun Shell Steel Ball Jungle Combat Experimental, though everyone just called them Callahan shells, regardless of my protests that the concept wasn't particularly original or complex. Similar ammunition had been used informally in various conflicts, and the principles of using heavier projectiles for better penetration and energy retention weren't exactly revolutionary. I'd just applied common sense and basic ballistics to solve a specific tactical problem. The wider adoption of the ammunition saved lives throughout the division. Other units facing similar Banzai charges or conducting jungle patrols reported significantly improved effectiveness with the steel ball loads compared to standard buckshot. The extended effective range of the shotgun made it useful in situations where it previously would have been nearly worthless, and the improved penetration through jungle vegetation meant that defensive positions could engage attackers at ranges that gave them more time to break up assaults before they reached the perimeter. I received a Silver Star for my actions during the August 8th Banzai charge. The citation, carefully worded to emphasize exceptional courage and tactical innovation under combat conditions, without explicitly mentioning that the tactical innovation involved disobeying orders and manufacturing unauthorized ammunition. Captain Henderson put me in for the medal, which I appreciated even though we both knew it was partly a way of justifying after the fact that he'd chosen not to pursue disciplinary action for my insubordination. "You put me in an impossible position," Henderson told me when he informed me about the medal. "You violated regulations, disobeyed orders, and manufactured unauthorized equipment. You also saved lives and solved a genuine tactical problem that our standard equipment wasn't addressing. The Army doesn't know how to handle situations where doing the wrong thing by the book produces better results than doing the right thing. So we give you a medal and pretend that makes it all okay." "Does it make it all okay, sir?" I asked. "No," Henderson replied honestly, "but it's the best solution we've got. Just don't make a habit of ignoring my orders, even when you think you're right. The fact that you were right this time doesn't mean you'll be right next time, and I can't run a company where every sergeant decides which orders to follow based on their personal judgment." He was right, and I knew it. Military effectiveness requires discipline and standardization, not just tactical innovation. The balance between following procedures and adapting to circumstances is difficult, and there's no easy answer for when it's appropriate to deviate from established norms. I'd gotten lucky that my deviation worked and that the tactical situation vindicated the risk I'd taken, but Henderson was correct that I couldn't make a pattern of deciding which orders applied and which didn't. The steel ball ammunition continued in use throughout the rest of the Pacific War, eventually being formally adopted as standard issue for jungle combat operations. After the war, it fell out of favor as the military returned to peacetime standardization and as shotguns themselves became less common in infantry units. But during 1944 and 1945, those improvised shells saved lives and gave soldiers fighting in jungle conditions a more effective tool for the combat they faced. I stayed in the Army after the war, serving through Korea and eventually retiring as a master sergeant in 1962. The steel ball shell incident followed me throughout my career, sometimes as a positive example of tactical innovation, sometimes as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unauthorized improvisation. I never quite figured out which interpretation was more accurate. Corporal Martinez, who'd helped me develop the ammunition, survived the war and went back to New Mexico, where he opened his own gunsmith shop. We stayed in touch over the years, occasionally reminiscing about our time in the Pacific and the ammunition that had caused so much controversy. "You know what I think about sometimes?" Martinez said during a visit to his shop in 1968. "If you'd been wrong about those steel balls, if they'd failed during that Banzai charge, or if they'd caused weapon malfunctions, you'd have been court-martialed and probably spent years in military prison. The difference between being a hero and being a prisoner was literally whether your unauthorized improvisation worked. That's a hell of a thing to think about." "Yeah, well, I had 24 rounds to be right," I replied. Turned out that was enough. I'm 83 years old now, long retired, living in Alabama, not far from where I grew up. Occasionally, military historians or ammunition collectors contact me about the steel ball shells, wanting technical details or historical context. I always tell them the same thing. It was a practical solution to a specific problem, developed through testing and refinement, and it worked because the tactical situation called for exactly what it provided. The lesson from that experience wasn't about ammunition design or ballistics. It was about the tension between following established procedures and adapting to circumstances that those procedures weren't designed to address. The military runs on standardization, discipline and adherence to regulations for good reasons, but combat is unpredictable, enemies adapt, and situations arise that weren't anticipated by whoever wrote the procedures. Sometimes, survival requires thinking beyond the manual and taking risks that violate established norms. The key is judgment, knowing when the situation genuinely demands deviation from standard practice versus when you're just being reckless or arrogant. I'd tested my ammunition extensively before that night. I understood the ballistics and had verified the safety and effectiveness through careful experimentation. I wasn't guessing or improvising blindly. I was applying technical knowledge to solve a specific tactical problem. That's different from just ignoring orders because you feel like it. Captain Henderson understood that distinction, which is why he chose to pursue recognition rather than punishment after the fact. He didn't approve of my disobedience, but he recognized that the circumstances had vindicated the technical judgment behind it. That's the kind of leadership the military needs. People who understand when to enforce rules and when to recognize that results matter more than procedures. My name is Robert Callahan, and I was 28 years old when I developed ammunition that violated Army regulations, got me threatened with court-martial, and ultimately was credited with helping stop a massive enemy assault. That experience taught me that sometimes the right answer isn't in the manual, but you'd better be damn sure you're right before you decide to ignore what the manual says. The difference between innovation and insubordination is often just whether your unauthorized solution actually works when it matters most.